The horizon burns gold over a restless northern sea. Waves smash against black cliffs, and spray cuts across the faces of those who dare approach. The wind carries a whisper from a time long forgotten. It speaks of survival, of hunger, of men and women who would risk everything to conquer the waves and the lands beyond. Most people think the story of the Vikings begins with a raid, a ship sliding into a monastery under cover of darkness. They are wrong. It begins long before the first sword was drawn, long before the first ship broke the horizon. It begins with a fear so deep and so sharp that it shaped an entire civilization, a fear of vanishing, of being swallowed by a sea that both gave life and took it away without mercy. On a single cold morning, centuries before the Viking Age officially began, that fear forced people to make choices that would echo across history, choices that would turn isolated communities into empires of the sea. The land itself was merciless: thin soil, jagged rocks, winters that could crush an entire village in weeks, summers that were short and punishing. The Scandinavian North demanded toughness. Weakness could mean death. Survival depended on cunning, strength, and an unbreakable relationship with the sea. People didn't just live near the water, they lived because of it. It fed them, carried them, and protected them. And yet it could just as easily drown them. Every wave was both a promise and a threat, and in death, their connection to the sea only deepened. Across Scandinavia, archaeologists have discovered graves carved in the shape of ships, enormous stone outlines that rise like frozen waves from the earth. Some are small, holding only a single warrior. Others stretch 30 meters, like ghostly vessels waiting to sail into the afterlife. These were not monuments, they were declarations, statements of power, identity, and belief. The ship was life, and the ship was death. It carried souls to the world beyond. It was a bridge between the living and the gods. Long before the first Viking raid, people were already burying their leaders and warriors in boats, filling them with weapons, food, and treasures. It was a ritual of both fear and respect. And then, in 2011, a discovery on the Baltic island of Saaremaa, in Estonia, turned everything historians thought they knew upside down. 2 massive boats were unearthed, each holding the bodies of warriors who had died in a violent battle. 40 men in total, their skulls broken, their bodies hacked apart. Evidence of a brutal fight that must have left survivors staggering through the carnage. The shock came when the dating results returned. These warriors lived around 650 AD. That is more than 100 years before the first known Viking raids. Pre-Vikings, proto-Vikings, forgotten men and women at the start of a story the world thought it knew. Strontium analysis revealed they were not from Estonia. They came from the heart of Sweden, from Lake Mälaren, a thriving community that would later become a hub of Viking power. They were warriors of exceptional skill, elite soldiers with the discipline of a small army, not raiders acting on impulse, but people prepared for war, trained for conquest, and honored in death with meticulous care. Their burial was shocking for its precision. Separated body parts, yet placed in anatomically correct order, respectful, deliberate, almost loving in the midst of violence. These were not criminals or opportunists. These were men of status, men whose society already had rules, rituals, and honor codes, long before the world recognized the Vikings. They had weapons, yes, but their graves contained something more important: evidence of planning, wealth, and the kind of civilization capable of building ships that could carry them across oceans and rivers. Ships that would one day make the Vikings legends of the North. Lake Mälaren itself tells part of the story, a natural gateway to the Baltic. Its rivers and waterways connected communities, trade routes, and the seeds of empires yet to come. Here, powerful families controlled commerce, taxed travelers, and displayed their wealth with precision. They built long houses, reception halls, ports, and ships of staggering craftsmanship. They buried their dead with helmets that could rival any crown, with shields and vessels meant to serve them in the afterlife. These were not simple farmers. They were strategists, politicians, traders, and warriors. Their lives were intertwined with power, violence, and opportunity, and their deaths reflected that same complexity. But perhaps the most surprising revelations came from the women. Archaeology has shown that some of the grandest ship burials were for women of status, buried with wealth, weapons, and even slaves to accompany them into the next world. One grave south of Oslo contained a ship with the remains of two women, one older, one younger, both laid to rest with honor. The older woman was likely in her 80s, an age extraordinary for the era. She was buried with a sledge, a cart, and a slave woman whose DNA traced back to the Caspian region. Her ship had sailed decades before she was laid to rest. Every detail suggested not just power but influence, far-reaching connections, and the ability to control resources, people, and trade across enormous distances. Ship burials, battles, and trade hubs like Lake Mälaren reveal that the Viking Age didn't arrive overnight. It evolved from centuries of preparation, growth, and careful strategy. These were communities rich in skill, in knowledge of the seas, in courage, and in ambition. The pre-Vikings were the architects of the age to come. They had mastered the waters, understood the rivers, and built societies capable of sustaining long campaigns, both in war and in trade. And yet, the world beyond Scandinavia had no idea they were coming. The rivers of Russia, the coasts of the Baltic, the islands of the North Sea, all were about to feel the force of a civilization that had been quietly rising for centuries. A civilization born from fear, tempered by survival, and driven by opportunity. The proto-Vikings were ready to step into history, to become raiders, traders, explorers, and kings. And the first spark that would ignite the Viking Age was closer than anyone realized, a ship preserved for centuries, waiting to tell its story. A ship that belonged to a woman, a leader whose reach stretched farther than most of her male counterparts. Her story would challenge everything we thought we knew about Viking society, about gender, power, and influence in the north. And it would prove one undeniable truth. The Vikings were never just raiders. They were innovators, politicians, warriors, and rulers shaped by the harshest environment on earth. The sea had forged them. The land had tested them, and now they were ready to claim the world. The wind carries a chill that bites the skin, but it does not scare them. It never did. They have learned to read the waves like a book, to understand the language of the currents and the whispers of the wind. Every ship that leaves the harbor is a statement, every voyage a message. We are here, and we will not be ignored. Lake Mälaren stretches like a silver mirror, reflecting the jagged edges of the surrounding forests. This was the heart of a growing power, a place where rivers and trade routes converge. Here, chiefs and nobles controlled not just land, but the flow of wealth. Traders from the east, from the lands of the Rus and beyond, brought silver, silk, and spices. They were taxed, yes, but they were also protected. It was a delicate balance. One misstep could ignite conflict. One refusal could end in death. It was in these riverside communities that the blueprint of Viking power was formed. The first longhouses were built, their timber thick and strong, rising above the muddy streets where craftsmen worked tirelessly. Weapons were forged, ships constructed, and alliances solidified. Everything had a purpose. Everything was calculated. Even the dead were used to reinforce social hierarchies. Graves were not only for remembrance, they were displays of status, monuments that spoke louder than words, and the ships were the centerpiece of it all. Long, sleek, and perfectly balanced, built to navigate both the open seas and narrow rivers. They could carry warriors, goods, and ideas across vast distances. These were not just vessels, they were symbols of ambition, power, and freedom. The sea was the lifeline, the road, and sometimes the weapon. Farther north, on the wind-swept island of Karoya, the first raiders were preparing. Generations had trained for this moment without even knowing it. Children learned to row before they could walk. Boys and girls alike were taught to handle an axe or a spear. The coastline was their classroom, the sea their teacher. Every rock, every tidal pool, every hidden cove was memorized. They would not be caught unprepared. It was here that the first spark of true Viking ambition ignited. Not all raids were violent. Not all voyages were for conquest. Some were trading expeditions, some were scouting missions, but every journey carried the potential for violence, for glory, and for stories that would be told for generations. News of distant lands, of weak monasteries and rich towns, traveled quickly through these waterways. Word of wealth spread faster than the ships themselves. Archaeologists have found the evidence. Beakers from France, glass from the Mediterranean, even a bronze Buddha from the distant lands of the Swat Valley. Objects that seem impossible to link to the cold northern forests of Sweden. Yet, they existed here, in the hands of a people who knew how to navigate the rivers, negotiate with traders, and, if necessary, dominate anyone who dared challenge them. Power was not given, it was taken, but it was also earned. Every leader, every chieftain, understood that loyalty had to be rewarded, that fear had to be respected, and that wealth alone could never guarantee survival. Every expedition had stakes that went beyond silver or silk. It was about reputation, honor, and the legacy one would leave behind. And then there were the women. Not passive observers, not bystanders. Archaeological evidence shows that women commanded ships, owned estates, and even went to war. One of the most extraordinary graves ever found contained a woman in her 80s, laid to rest with a ship, weapons, and a slave whose origins traced thousands of miles east. Her influence was not only local but far-reaching, a testament to the power some women wielded in these early societies. The stories of these women challenge every stereotype, proving that leadership and courage were not bound by gender. The villages along Lake Mälaren and the surrounding rivers became training grounds, laboratories for the tactics and skills that would define the Viking Age. Every child learned to row, to fight, and to negotiate. Every elder passed down stories, songs, and knowledge that connected the present to the past. These communities were not static. They were evolving, adapting, and preparing for the era that would soon sweep across Europe. Then came the first raids that historians would recognize. Small, calculated, precise. They were not chaotic acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated strikes that targeted wealth, resources, and strategic positions. Monasteries, towns, and ports along the coasts felt the first shockwaves. The reputation of the Vikings began to spread, not just as warriors, but as opportunists who could strike anywhere at any time. Fear became their ally. Respect followed, and with each raid, the mythology of the Vikings grew. But for every successful voyage, there were failures. Ships lost at sea, warriors defeated in battle, settlements burned by rivals. The sea was both ally and adversary. It taught them humility as often as it rewarded them. Every triumph carried a lesson, every disaster a warning. This duality forged the Vikings into something more than raiders. They became survivors, strategists and innovators. They learned to adapt faster than anyone else. They became unpredictable, and unpredictability was their greatest weapon. The rivers of Russia, the coasts of England, the islands of Scotland, they all began to feel the reach of these northern voyagers. Not all attacks were violent. Some were trade missions, some reconnaissance, and some alliances that laid the groundwork for future expansion. But each journey carried the same principle: control the water, control the wealth, and command the respect of those who live by it. By the early 9th century, the first great Viking fleets began to appear. They were larger, more organized, and equipped for both war and trade. The designs of their ships evolved, influenced by decades of experimentation and experience. The knowledge passed down from pre-Viking societies became the foundation for their dominance. Every timber, every sail, every oar carried the lessons of generations. The story of the Vikings is not just about conquest. It is about adaptation, preparation, and the relentless pursuit of survival in a world that offered no guarantees. They were raiders, yes, but they were also traders, explorers, and kings. They controlled commerce, politics, and territory in ways that would shape Europe for centuries. And it all began here, in these cold, unforgiving lands, with communities that refused to disappear. They mastered the seas, harnessed fear, and turned ambition into legend. The first ships left the river mouths, cutting through mist and fog, carrying warriors, traders, and dreams. Each journey was a story waiting to be told, each landing a chapter in a saga that would resonate for 1,000 years. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a world awaited that had no idea the storm was coming, and this storm would not just bring destruction, it would bring opportunity, transformation, and the birth of a civilization that would be remembered forever. The Proto-Vikings were ready. The world would soon learn their name. The morning mist hung low over the water, curling around the prow of the longship as it cut through the waves. The men aboard were silent, their eyes scanning the horizon. Every movement, every sound had meaning. They had been trained for years for moments like this. Moments when survival and ambition collided. The sea was calm for now, but everyone knew it could turn violent in seconds. The waves were never loyal. They offered passage, but demanded respect. This was not a journey of chance. It was a mission, carefully planned, rehearsed in the villages upriver. Every man knew his role, every sailor his station. The longship itself was a marvel of craftsmanship, designed to glide across open waters and navigate narrow rivers with equal precision. Its wooden planks sang under the rhythm of the oars, a song older than history itself. Each strike of the blade against water echoed a promise: we are coming, and we will not be ignored. The Vikings had learned patience. They waited for the right moment, for the right tide, for the right opportunity to strike. Intelligence mattered as much as strength. Scouts had returned with news from distant lands, towns lightly defended, monasteries wealthy beyond measure, traders vulnerable to interception. The world was full of opportunities, and the Vikings had mastered the art of turning knowledge into power. As they approached the shore, tension tightened like a bowstring. The villagers on the coastline had no idea what was coming. From their perspective, life continued as normal, but the sea had betrayed them. A shadow moved in the morning fog, long and dark, and then it became clear. It was not one ship, it was a fleet, a black line on the horizon, moving with silent precision. Panic would come later. First, there was the calm, the inevitability of fate. The first boat reached the shore, and warriors leapt into the shallows. Feet, sank into wet sand as shields rose, spears aimed. The moment was brief, but decisive. Chaos erupted as the villagers scrambled, unprepared for the speed and coordination of these northern raiders. Every strike was calculated, every movement purposeful. This was not mindless violence. It was war, as an art form. Yet, not all raids ended in bloodshed. Trade was just as important as terror. In some towns, the Vikings negotiated, leveraging both fear and promise. They understood that wealth could be gained without killing, that power could be secured with strategy instead of swords. A silver ingot here, a barrel of grain there, and influence spread quietly, leaving behind a network of loyalty and dependence that would support future expeditions. The dual nature of the Vikings, traders and raiders, made them unpredictable and feared. One day they could be friends, the next, enemies. Every interaction was a test, a negotiation, a demonstration of skill and power, and as word of their ability spread, so did their reputation. Tales of swift ships, brutal warriors, and clever negotiators traveled faster than the fleets themselves. By the time they reached England or the coasts of Francia, their names carried weight. A single encounter could determine the fate of a town or a merchant. In the villages along Lake Mälaren, life continued as the raiders ventured farther afield. Families farmed, craftsmen worked, and children learned to row before they could walk. Knowledge of the sea was passed down through generations. Every skill mattered. Every mistake could be fatal. Survival depended on the perfect combination of strength, cunning, and courage, and so the cycle continued. Prepare, train, and strike when the opportunity arose. Meanwhile, the women of these communities were far from passive. They oversaw trade, managed resources, and sometimes commanded ships. Archaeological evidence shows that their graves, when discovered, often contained weapons and treasures, suggesting they held positions of authority. One remarkable burial south of Oslo revealed a woman in her 80s, surrounded by a ship, a slave, and goods collected from distant lands. Her influence stretched farther than many men's, proving that power in the Viking world was not restricted by gender. These women were essential to the society's survival and expansion. They ensured continuity, managed logistics, and sometimes even led in battle. Their status was recognized in life and honored in death. Ships were not just for warriors, they were symbols of influence, wealth, and spiritual connection. And these women, alongside men, helped shape the strategies, alliances, and ambitions that would propel the Vikings into history. As the raids continued, patterns began to emerge. The Vikings exploited both geography and human behavior. Rivers served as highways deep into enemy territory. Knowledge of tides, currents, and seasonal changes allowed them to strike where and when others least expected. Coastal towns that believed themselves safe were suddenly vulnerable. Every journey carried the potential for wealth or disaster, and every decision had consequences that rippled across generations. The expansion of Viking influence was not random. It followed careful planning. Communities along rivers, lakes, and coastlines created networks of support. Farms produced food for long voyages, smiths forged weapons, and shipbuilders perfected designs capable of crossing open seas. Every element of society contributed to the success of their expeditions. The pre-Vikings had laid the foundations. By the 9th century, those foundations were ready to support an empire built on mobility, strategy, and adaptability. The sea remained the ultimate teacher. Storms destroyed ships, tides delayed expeditions, and frozen rivers blocked passage for months. Yet every failure was a lesson. Every challenge improved techniques and strategies. By combining skill, knowledge, and daring, the Vikings turned the unpredictable waters into their greatest advantage. They learned to move faster, strike harder, and retreat when necessary. Adaptation became survival. Survival became power. By the time they reached the coasts of Britain, Francia, and beyond, the Vikings had already transformed from local warriors into an unstoppable force. Their ships were extensions of themselves, every plank, sail, and oar infused with generations of knowledge. They carried more than warriors. They carried ambition, strategy, and the legacy of communities that had thrived under harsh northern skies. And yet, for all their preparation and skill, the Vikings depended on timing, luck, and the choices of those they encountered. One misjudged tide, one miscalculated resistance, and the line between glory and disaster was razor thin. This balance between control and chaos defined every journey, every raid, every conquest. As fleets moved across the North Sea, rivers and coasts, the story of the Vikings expanded, not just as raiders, but as explorers, traders, and rulers. They built networks that linked the north to distant lands, establishing trade routes, alliances, and settlements. Their influence stretched farther than anyone imagined, yet it was always rooted in their mastery of the sea. The river mouths, the coastal harbors, the forests that hid their villages, all were part of a carefully orchestrated world. Every voyage reinforced knowledge, strengthened society, and spread influence. The Vikings were no longer just survivors. They were strategists, innovators, and empire builders. Every journey, every raid, every trade mission was a calculated step in a grand design. And so, from the mists of northern rivers to the shores of distant lands, the Vikings began to write the story that the world would never forget. They were raiders, yes, but also traders and kings. Every conquest, every negotiation, every victory and loss built a civilization that would leave a mark on history. Their story was just beginning, and the waves they traveled would carry them far, far beyond anything their ancestors could have imagined. The first light of dawn broke over the Baltic, painting the water in shades of silver and grey. The longships sliced through the calm surface, each oar dipping in perfect rhythm. Silence ruled for a moment, but beneath it, tension hummed like a tightly wound string. These men and women knew the stakes. Every voyage was a gamble, every landing a potential disaster. The sea did not forgive mistakes, and the Vikings had learned that lesson countless times. On the shore, a small trading settlement stirred awake, unaware of the shadows moving toward them. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the smell of bread and cooking fish drifted across the river. Children ran barefoot across the muddy paths, and merchants unpacked their goods. They had no idea that their lives were about to be upended by a people who understood the value of preparation, precision, and fear. The Vikings struck like lightning. There was no warning. Shields rose, spears swung, and the first clash erupted with brutal efficiency. But this was not mindless slaughter. Every movement was intentional, every strike calculated. The raiders targeted leaders first, then merchants, then defenses. Wealth was collected quickly, and survivors were left alive only if they served a purpose. This was a method honed over generations, passed down from pre-Viking societies that had understood power, survival, and the importance of timing long before the world even recognized their existence. While the warriors took the village, other ships remained on the water. Scouts circled the coastline, watching for reinforcements, noting weak points, and preparing for contingencies. This level of coordination was extraordinary for the time. These were not disorganized marauders. They were disciplined, strategic, and ruthlessly effective. And as the villagers cried out in panic, they would remember only one thing. The sea had delivered its predators, and no one knew where they would strike next. Beyond the immediate chaos, trade continued to be just as vital as conquest. The Vikings understood the balance between terror and diplomacy. In some towns, silver was taken; in others, goods were exchanged. Some leaders offered allegiance or payment in exchange for protection, realizing that resistance could be deadly, but cooperation could yield long-term gain. The Vikings' reputation grew not just from fear, but from shrewdness, adaptability, and an uncanny ability to turn every situation to their advantage. As fleets returned home, laden with wealth and news, life along Lake Malaran remained a delicate balance of preparation and patience. Children trained in the rivers, learning to row and fight before they could walk properly. Men practiced with weapons forged by the finest smiths. Women oversaw logistics, managed estates, and sometimes commanded ships themselves. Every member of the community had a role to play, and each role contributed to the growing power that would soon dominate Northern Europe. The pre-Vikings had laid the groundwork, but by the 9th century the organization had reached a new level. Longships were faster, more resilient, and capable of long-distance voyages across open seas. Warriors carried armor, shields, and weapons designed for both offense and defense. Strategy and intelligence became as important as brute strength. And as these fleets moved outward, the scale of their ambition became clear. No longer were they raiding for survival; they were expanding influence, forging empires, and controlling trade routes across continents. The rivers of Russia, the islands of Scotland, the coasts of England and Francia all began to feel the impact of these northern voyages. The Vikings were everywhere, unpredictable and unstoppable. Some settlements offered tribute, others resisted and faced destruction. In every encounter, the Vikings learned, adapted, and evolved. Their knowledge of tides, currents, and seasonal changes gave them an advantage no one else possessed. Geography was a weapon, as much as a shield. In the midst of this expansion, archaeology reveals a startling truth. Women were not merely passive observers. Some commanded ships, others managed trade networks, and many were buried with treasures, weapons, and slaves to accompany them into the afterlife. One remarkable burial in Norway contained a woman in her 80s, surrounded by a ship and goods from distant lands. Her influence spanned rivers and coasts, proving that power in Viking society was earned through skill, strategy, and legacy, not just through gender. Every journey, every raid, every trade mission reinforced the growing network of power. Farms, longhouses, and ports supplied food, materials, and manpower for expeditions. Blacksmiths forged weapons capable of devastating blows. Shipbuilders perfected designs that allowed fleets to move with unprecedented speed and precision. Communities worked together, each member understanding that their survival and prosperity depended on the success of these voyages. But for all their preparation, the Vikings depended on luck, timing, and the choices of those they encountered. A single misjudged tide, a delayed supply, or an unexpected resistance could turn victory into disaster. Chaos was ever present, and the Vikings thrived because they learned to navigate it. They became unpredictable, using intelligence and strategy to turn potential setbacks into advantages. Every voyage was a lesson, every failure a step toward mastery. By the early 9th century, the Vikings had become a force of nature. Their longships crossed seas and rivers with unmatched precision. They carried warriors, traders, diplomats, and envoys, spreading influence, wealth, and knowledge across Europe. The world began to take notice, and fear of the northern raiders became widespread. Yet the Vikings were more than warriors. They were explorers, empire builders, and masters of strategy. Even as empires rose in Europe, the Vikings continued to evolve. They built settlements, established trade networks, and integrated with local populations. Their influence extended far beyond raids. They controlled commerce, collected tribute, and sometimes became rulers themselves. Each expedition was a calculated step, building the framework of an empire that combined fear, diplomacy, and unmatched knowledge of the seas. And through it all, the sea remained their teacher. Storms destroyed ships, rivers froze, and tides shifted unpredictably. Yet every challenge improved their techniques. Every disaster became a lesson. They learned to respect and manipulate the waters, to strike when least expected, and to retreat when necessary. Adaptation became survival. Survival became power. Power became legend. From the quiet rivers of Scandinavia to the coasts of England, Francia, and beyond, the Vikings were leaving an indelible mark on history. They were raiders, yes, but also traders, explorers, and rulers. Each journey, each conquest, each encounter contributed to a civilization defined by mastery of the seas, intelligence, and unyielding ambition. The story was no longer about survival alone. It was about influence, strategy, and legacy. The Vikings had evolved from pre-Viking warriors into architects of an age that would shape Europe for centuries. Every landing, every ship, every victory brought them closer to legend, and the world was only beginning to understand what these northern voyagers were capable of. The northern winds cut through the sails as the fleet moved steadily toward the distant coast. Every ship glided like a shadow across the water, a line of dark intent against the morning sky. Silence fell over the rowers, but tension crackled in the air. The Vikings had learned long ago that the calm before the storm often carried the heaviest danger. A single misstep, a sudden storm, or an unexpected enemy could turn triumph into disaster. Yet they moved forward, trained and confident, each stroke of the oar a step closer to destiny. The first settlements they approached were small, unfortified, and unaware. Smoke from chimneys curled lazily into the sky, children ran barefoot through narrow streets, and merchants carried baskets of goods, oblivious to the shadow sliding toward them across the water. The Vikings struck with precision. Shields raised, spears aimed, and the first clash erupted like a controlled explosion. There was no panic among the raiders, only methodical action. Each move was calculated. Leaders were targeted first, merchants second, and defenses last. The operation was brutal, yet efficient, and the outcome was almost predetermined. But not every encounter was a massacre. The Vikings understood balance. Fear was a tool, not an obsession. In some towns, silver was taken, agreements forged, and trade networks expanded. Survival and influence were intertwined. Diplomacy and terror existed side by side, creating a network of obedience and cooperation that extended far beyond the immediate raid. Every interaction was strategic. Every decision carried weight, shaping not only the present but the future of their empire. As the raiders returned to the rivers and lakes of their homeland, life in the villages continued. Children trained, learning to row before they could walk. Warriors honed their skills with axes and swords. Women commanded ships, managed trade, and occasionally led men into battle. Society was organized, every role understood, every individual essential. Preparation for the next voyage began the moment one ended. The Vikings knew that survival required constant adaptation, that every expedition built toward something greater. Trade and conquest were inseparable. Bronze from the Mediterranean, silks from the east, silver from local mines, These goods moved through Viking hands, creating wealth and influence. Longhouses became centers of strategy and governance. Ports and reception halls stood as symbols of power. The pre-Viking generations had built the foundations, and by the 9th century, these communities had evolved into a complex network capable of sustaining long-distance expeditions. The rivers became highways, the forests hiding training grounds, the coastlines gateways to opportunity and danger alike. The world beyond Scandinavia began to feel their presence. England, Francia, the coasts of the North Sea. Everywhere there were tales of lighting raids, cunning negotiation, and unstoppable longships. The Vikings were unpredictable. One day traders, the next raiders. Their ability to switch between fear and diplomacy kept rivals off balance. They learned from each encounter, adapted to local conditions, and exploited weaknesses with precision. Their reach extended farther with every journey, and their reputation grew, spreading fear and respect in equal measure. In this era of expansion, women held positions of power that are often overlooked in history. Burial sites reveal women commanding ships, managing resources, and wielding influence equal to men. One of the most remarkable graves discovered in Norway contained a woman in her 80s, buried with a ship, weapons, and goods sourced from distant lands. Her legacy demonstrates that power in Viking society was earned through skill, strategy, and leadership, not just inherited or restricted by gender. These women were instrumental in maintaining the economy, directing expeditions, and shaping social hierarchies. The Vikings' mastery of the sea was central to their rise. They studied tides, understood currents, and timed their journeys with precision. Storms and frozen rivers were obstacles, but also teachers. Every disaster became a lesson, every challenge an opportunity to innovate. They turned unpredictability into an advantage, striking when least expected and retreating when necessary. Adaptation was survival, survival was power. Power became legend. As the fleets advanced deeper into Europe, their influence expanded. They founded settlements, controlled trade routes, and integrated with local populations. Their empire was not built solely on violence, but on knowledge, strategy, and adaptability. Every village, every river mouth, every coastline was both a stage and a weapon in the Vikings' unfolding story. They became more than raiders. They became rulers, traders, and explorers. Their ships were not just tools of war, but symbols of ambition, innovation, and connection between distant lands. The Vikings' reach was not just physical but cultural. They spread ideas, technology, and customs across the regions they touched. Communities along rivers and coasts adapted, learning new skills, adopting trade practices, and integrating aspects of Viking culture. These exchanges were subtle but powerful. Influence traveled as quickly as the longships themselves, and by the early 10th century, the imprint of the Vikings was visible across much of northern Europe. Yet, the sea remained unpredictable. Even the most skilled captains could not control storms, shifting tides, or sudden currents. Every voyage carried risk. Every expedition could end in disaster. But the Vikings thrived in this uncertainty. They had evolved to exploit it, using speed, intelligence, and audacity to turn potential catastrophe into opportunity. Their unpredictability became their greatest weapon, leaving enemies unsure when, where, or how they would strike next. By now, the Vikings were no longer local warriors. They were strategists, innovators, and empire builders. They carried knowledge and experience accumulated over generations. Every voyage, every raid, every negotiation was part of a larger plan, an evolving strategy that transformed Northern Europe forever. They moved with purpose, precision, and ambition, each expedition expanding their influence and reinforcing the power of their homeland. And the story continued to unfold. From the rivers of Scandinavia to the coasts of England, Francia, and beyond, the Vikings established themselves as a dominant force. They were raiders, yes, but also explorers, traders, and rulers. Every conquest, every trade agreement, every alliance contributed to a civilization defined by mastery of the sea, intelligence, and unyielding ambition. The legacy of these northern voyagers was only beginning, and the world would soon feel the full force of their ingenuity and courage. The horizon stretched wide and empty, but the Vikings saw opportunity in every inch of water. The longships rode the waves like predators, sleek and silent, waiting for the moment to strike. Each man and woman aboard knew the rhythm of the sea, understood the whispers of wind and tide. It was a language taught from birth, learned in rivers and fjords, tested in storms and raids. To outsiders, the sea was terrifying. To the Vikings, it was home, battlefield, and highway all at once. As they approached a cluster of coastal settlements, scouts crept ahead, moving through fog and reeds. Their eyes missed nothing. The smoke of chimneys, the movement of villages, the placement of livestock and stores of grain. Every detail mattered. The Vikings did not rely on luck alone. They relied on knowledge. Their strikes were precise because every choice was deliberate. Timing, positioning, and preparation were weapons as lethal as axes or spears. The attack began with the rising sun. Boats slid into shallow water, and warriors leapt into action. Shields clanged, spears pierced, and chaos spread through the unsuspecting village. Panic gripped the residents, but the Vikings moved with practiced efficiency. Leaders and traders were singled out first. The wealth seized quickly, and the population left with a message. Resistance was dangerous, but cooperation could bring safety. Violence and strategy worked hand in hand. One act built fear, the other built influence, and together they created a network of dominance that expanded their reach far beyond the battlefield. Meanwhile, behind the raids, life in the villages along the rivers continued with disciplined routine. Children learned the oars before they could walk. Warriors practiced sword and axe, and women oversaw trade, supplies, and sometimes led expeditions themselves. Every individual had a role, and every role supported the larger structure of society. These communities were never idle. Every day built skills, knowledge, and strength that would be deployed in the next voyage, the next strike, the next opportunity. Trade, too, was a powerful weapon. The Vikings did not simply take, they exchanged, negotiated, and established routes that brought silver, spices, and rare objects to the north. Archaeologists have uncovered bronze vessels from the Mediterranean, glass from France, and even a bronze Buddha from the Swat Valley, dating centuries before the famous raids. Every object told a story of movement, of connection, of influence. The Vikings were not isolated barbarians. They were cosmopolitan, clever, and adept at turning commerce into power. The pre-Vikings had laid the foundation, but by the 9th century, these networks were more sophisticated than any outsider could imagine. Longhouses became centers of governance, ports hubs of commerce, and every river and coastline a stage for strategic expansion. Knowledge of tides, weather, and geography gave the Vikings an unmatched advantage. While others feared the waters, the Vikings understood them. The unpredictable became a tool, and every expedition carried lessons that improved the next. The women of Viking society played critical roles, often overlooked by history. Burials reveal women who commanded ships, managed estates, and influenced trade and military decisions. One woman, buried in Norway in her 80s, had traveled widely in life and was interred with a ship, a slave, and treasures collected from distant lands. She had wielded authority, strategy, and vision that rivaled any man. These women shaped the economy, society, and expansion of Viking influence, proving that leadership was not defined by gender, but by capability. Every raid, every trading mission, every voyage served to reinforce a system that combined fear, diplomacy, and knowledge. Success was measured not just in wealth, but in influence and control. Tributary towns, alliances, and settlements created networks that extended Viking reach further than the eye could see. Adaptation was crucial. The Vikings thrived in a world of uncertainty because they mastered unpredictability, turning challenges into advantages. Even as their fame spread, the Vikings faced constant threats from nature. Storms, shifting tides, and frozen rivers were ever-present dangers. Each disaster taught lessons in navigation, shipbuilding, and survival. Every challenge strengthened their fleet and sharpened their strategy. Speed, intelligence, and adaptability became weapons that no enemy could predict. The sea itself became both a mentor and an ally, shaping a civilization capable of extraordinary feats. By now, the Vikings were no longer raiders in isolation. They were strategists, innovators, and empire builders. They carried the experience of generations, refining every technique and strategy with each expedition. Longships sailed further, fleets coordinated more efficiently, and their presence became a force across northern Europe. Influence, trade, and conquest blended seamlessly. The Vikings were everywhere, yet nowhere could predict where they would appear next. Settlements along rivers and coasts became centers of power. Farms supplied food for long voyages. Blacksmiths produced weapons of superior quality. Shipbuilders perfected designs that allowed fleets to move with precision. Every element of society contributed to expansion and dominance. Knowledge, skill, and ambition became a culture that spread as quickly as the ships themselves. By the early 10th century, the Vikings had transformed Europe. Their raids, trade networks, and settlements left indelible marks on the landscape and culture. England, Francia, and the coasts of the North Sea bore the imprint of these northern voyagers. Yet the Vikings were more than conquerors. They were explorers, administrators, and rulers. Every success was built on preparation, intelligence, and mastery of the sea. And still, the story of the Vikings was only beginning. Each journey, each battle, each trade mission carried the promise of new discoveries, alliances, and challenges. Their civilization was not static. It evolved with every expedition, every encounter, and every victory. They were raiders, yes, but also navigators of commerce, culture, and politics. Their influence would ripple across generations, shaping not only the North, but the entire continent. As longships disappeared into the horizon, carrying warriors and traders alike, the world waited unknowingly. The Vikings were coming, not just as raiders, but as forces of history, shaping kingdoms, economies, and cultures. The northern seas had produced more than warriors. They had produced a civilization that would be remembered forever. The wind was colder now, sharper, cutting across the deck of the longship like a living blade. Every eye scanned the horizon. Every hand was steady on oar or rope. The Vikings had sailed these waters countless times, yet each journey carried the weight of uncertainty. Storms could appear without warning. Currents could shift, carrying a ship miles off course. And yet they trusted the sea. They had no choice. It was the path to wealth, power, and legend. Beyond the shoreline, a small trading port began to stir. Smoke spiraled from chimneys, dogs barked, and merchants unloaded goods without fear. They had no knowledge of the shadows gliding over the water. The Vikings had become masters of surprise, timing their attacks with precision learned over generations. There would be no warning, no chance to prepare. This was the moment when skill, courage, and strategy converged. The first boats reached the shore. Warriors leapt into the shallows, boots sinking into sand and mud. Shields rose, axes swung, and spears pierced the morning calm. The chaos was immediate, violent, yet controlled. Targets were precise, leaders and merchants first, then defenders. Wealth was seized quickly, and the remaining villagers were left with a message: submit, cooperate, or face ruin. Every action was a lesson in strategy. Every raid strengthened reputation, expanding influence across coasts and rivers alike. While raiders moved through the village, other ships remained on the water, circling, watching, ready to intercept reinforcements. Coordination was as lethal as the weapons they carried. The Vikings were unpredictable, blending fear and diplomacy with unmatched precision. One encounter could yield wealth, another knowledge, another strategic foothold. Every mission, every movement, carried the potential to shape the future of kingdoms far beyond Scandinavia. Meanwhile, the villages along the rivers were alive with preparation. Children learned the rhythm of the oars, practiced handling spears, and memorized the secrets of the waters. Men honed skills in combat and strategy. Women oversaw trade, managed resources, and sometimes commanded ships. Every member of the community contributed to the growing power of the North. These villages were laboratories, training grounds, and strategic centers that produced the next generation of raiders, explorers, and rulers. Trade remained a weapon, as potent as the axe or sword. Silver flowed into the hands of Viking chieftains, silk from the east, wine from the south, even treasures from lands that seemed impossibly distant. Archaeology reveals the breadth of these networks: Mediterranean bronze, French glass, and even a Buddha from the Swat Valley found far north in Sweden. Each object was a mark of ambition and reach, proof that these raiders were far more than barbarians. They were strategists, negotiators, and innovators. By the 9th century, the Vikings had perfected the art of mobility and precision. Longships were faster, more resilient, and capable of carrying men, goods, and ideas across oceans and rivers alike. Intelligence and planning became as vital as strength. Each expedition was designed to maximize gain and minimize risk. Knowledge of currents, tides, and geography gave the Vikings an edge no opponent could match. Every river bend, every hidden cove was memorized, every strategy tested in both war and trade. The role of women in Viking society was vital. Burial evidence shows women with weapons, wealth, and authority equal to men. One extraordinary burial in Norway contained a woman in her 80s, accompanied by a ship, treasures, and a slave whose origins stretched thousands of miles east. These women were leaders, strategists, and central figures in maintaining the economy, directing voyages, and consolidating power. Gender did not determine influence; skill, courage, and leadership did. Every raid, every trade mission, every voyage reinforced the structure of Viking society. Success depended on preparation, adaptability, and intelligence. Tributary towns, alliances, and settlements extended their influence far beyond the initial raids. The Vikings' unpredictability became their greatest weapon. Opponents never knew when or where they would strike next, and the Northmen used every advantage the sea and landscape could provide. Nature remained a constant teacher. Storms could sink ships, rivers could freeze, and tides could shift unexpectedly. Yet the Vikings adapted. Every disaster became a lesson, every challenge an opportunity to innovate. They learned to read the signs, to anticipate danger, and to exploit every advantage. Their mastery of unpredictability became central to their survival and success. By the early 10th century, the Vikings had become a dominant force across northern Europe. Their presence was felt in England, Francia, Ireland, and beyond. But their power was not built solely on violence. They were explorers, traders, rulers, and strategists. Each voyage expanded their reach, strengthened their society, and built a legacy that would endure for generations. The rivers, ports, and coastlines of Scandinavia were hubs of influence. Farms fed expeditions, blacksmiths supplied weapons, shipbuilders perfected designs capable of long-distance travel and combat. Every member of society contributed to the strength and resilience of the Vikings. Knowledge and skill became their currency, strategy their tool, and ambition their driving force. The long ships carried more than warriors. They carried culture, ideas, and influence. Every settlement, every conquest, every trade agreement spread the imprint of northern civilization. The Vikings were not just raiders. They were architects of an emerging empire, masters of the seas, and innovators who transformed the world around them. Even as they expanded, the Vikings relied on lessons learned from the past. Every raid, every battle, every trade mission taught them something new. They adapted, refined, and evolved. The unpredictability of the sea, the challenges of distant lands, and the resistance of those they encountered all shaped their strategies. They became faster, smarter, and more efficient with every journey. The story of the Vikings was no longer local. It was continental. Their raids, trade, and settlements connected lands that had never interacted before. They shaped economies, influenced politics, and established networks that would last for centuries. Every ship, every expedition, every leader contributed to a civilization that combined intelligence, strategy, and unparalleled mastery of the seas. The long ships sailed on, disappearing into mist and distance. Warriors and traders alike carried ambition, knowledge, and legacy. The world was unaware of what was coming, yet the northern seas had already produced a people destined to change it forever. These were the Vikings, raiders, traders, explorers, and kings. Their story was just beginning, and the waves they traveled would carry them far beyond anything imagined. The cold bite of winter had left the rivers still and glassy, reflecting the sky like dark crystal. The Vikings moved quietly, their long ships gliding across the water with an almost unnatural silence. Every rower felt the tension in the air, a mixture of anticipation and fear. The seas had been both ally and adversary for centuries. They rewarded skill and punished error, and in this frozen morning, the Vikings knew every mistake could be fatal. Ahead, the smoke of a distant settlement rose lazily into the sky. Its people were unprepared, absorbed in daily routines, unaware that predators were approaching across the water. The Vikings had learned to read signs that others missed. The tilt of a tree, the sound of birds scattering, the faint smell of smoke drifting downstream. Intelligence and observation were as vital as sword and shield. Every successful raid had depended on these subtle skills, honed over generations. The first boats touched the shoreline. Warriors leapt into shallow water, boots sinking into icy mud. Shields rose, spears poised, axes ready. The strike was swift and precise. Leaders and merchants singled out, wealth seized before panic could fully take hold. The villagers scrambled, disoriented by the speed and coordination of the raiders. Yet the Vikings moved with controlled purpose. Every action, every swing of an axe, was deliberate. This was not mindless violence. It was strategy made flesh. Beyond the immediate chaos, other ships circled the bay, scouts watching for reinforcements. The Vikings were masters of coordination and timing. Every movement, every maneuver had been practiced countless times before. They struck when the conditions were perfect and withdrew before the tide could turn against them. In war, as in life, patience and timing were everything, and the Vikings had both in abundance. Back in Scandinavia, villages along the rivers remained hubs of preparation and innovation. Children learned to row and fight before they could walk. Women managed estates, oversaw trade, and sometimes commanded expeditions. Men trained with weapons, forged by the finest smiths. Every member of society contributed to the growing strength of the Viking world. The success of every expedition depended on this preparation. The network of villages, farms, ports, and craftsmen allowed the Vikings to strike farther, faster, and more effectively than any other people of the age. Trade, as much as raiding, was a key pillar of their power. Objects from distant lands, bronze from the Mediterranean, glass from France, silk from the East, found their way into Viking hands, often centuries before their arrival in other parts of Europe. Archaeology confirms that the Vikings were not isolated barbarians, but sophisticated players in a complex web of trade and influence. These goods were symbols of power, proof that these northern raiders were masters not only of the seas, but also of strategy, negotiation, and cultural exchange. By the 9th century, Viking society had evolved into a sophisticated system of mobility, coordination, and intelligence. Longships were faster, more durable, capable of carrying men, goods, and knowledge across oceans and rivers alike. Expeditions were carefully planned, with contingencies for every scenario. Intelligence mattered as much as strength. Geography, tides, and currents became weapons, turning natural hazards into advantages. Knowledge was power, and the Vikings wielded it ruthlessly. Women played crucial roles in Viking society, often commanding ships, managing estates, and influencing politics. Burials reveal women with weapons, treasures, and slaves, proving they were not passive participants, but active shapers of strategy and power. One remarkable grave in Norway contained an elderly woman, her ship, and valuable goods from across distant lands. She had wielded authority in life and influence in death, shaping society, guiding expeditions, and ensuring the success of future generations. Every raid, trade mission, and expedition reinforced Viking society. Success depended on preparation, adaptability, and strategy. Tributary towns, alliances, and settlements expanded influence far beyond the battlefield. The Vikings' unpredictability became their strongest weapon. Enemies could never anticipate the next move. The sea, landscape, and intelligence became instruments of power, exploited with precision and discipline. Even nature tested the Vikings at every turn. Storms destroyed ships, frozen rivers halted travel, and tides shifted without warning. Yet these obstacles became lessons. Every disaster, every miscalculation, strengthened future strategies. Adaptability became survival. Survival became power. Power became legacy. The Vikings thrived because they understood that mastery required flexibility as much as strength. By the early 10th century, the Vikings had transformed northern Europe. Their raids, trade networks, and settlements left lasting impacts on England, Francia, Ireland, and beyond. But their dominance was not purely violent. They were explorers, traders, and rulers, each expedition building infrastructure, influence, and knowledge. Their reach extended beyond fear, extending into diplomacy, commerce, and culture. The rivers, ports, and coastlines of Scandinavia became the engines of an empire. Farms provided food, blacksmiths weapons, shipbuilders superior longships. Every member of society contributed to the success of expeditions. Knowledge Skill and preparation ensured that the Vikings could travel further, strike faster, and influence more. Every village was a strategic node in a network that spanned the continent. Their longships carried warriors, traders, and diplomats alike, spreading influence, culture, and ideas. Every conquest and trade mission left an imprint, shaping societies and economies. The Vikings were not only raiders, they were empire builders, strategists, and innovators. Every journey reinforced power, spread knowledge, and expanded their civilization. Even as their influence grew, the Vikings relied on lessons learned from previous voyages. Every raid taught them navigation, combat, and negotiation. Every misstep became a blueprint for improvement. Adaptation and learning became as critical as strength. The unpredictable nature of the seas and enemies made them faster, smarter, and more efficient with each expedition. The story of the Vikings was no longer local, it became continental. Their raids, settlements, and trade networks connected lands that had never interacted before. They shaped economies, influenced politics, and established cultural footprints that endured for centuries. Every expedition, every conquest, every ship contributed to a civilization defined by intelligence, strategy, and mastery of the seas. The longships sailed on into the horizon, carrying men and women who would be remembered forever. Warriors, traders, leaders, and explorers all moved as one, propelled by ambition and skill. The world had yet to understand the full power of these northern voyages. The Vikings were coming not just as raiders, but as forces of history shaping the kingdoms, economies, and cultures of Europe. The morning mist clung to the fjords like a shroud, softening the edges of the jagged coastline. The Vikings moved silently through the fog, their long ships ghostly shapes in the water. Every eye scanned the horizon, every hand gripped the oar tightly. They had crossed these waters countless times, but each journey carried the weight of uncertainty. The sea was both a lifeline and a threat, a teacher that demanded respect and attention. Ahead, smoke rose from a distant settlement, faint against the rising sun. The villagers were unaware of the predators approaching. Dogs barked, children played, merchants unloaded goods, and farmers tended fields. They would have no warning. The Vikings had mastered the art of observation and timing. Nothing escaped their notice. Every detail mattered. The way smoke curled from a chimney, the sound of a cart on the road, the movement of livestock. These signs guided the raiders, ensuring precision in their strike. The first longships reached the shore. Warriors leapt into the shallow water, axes swinging, shields raised. Chaos erupted instantly, but it was controlled, calculated. Leaders were targeted first, merchants second, and defenses last. Wealth was seized, fear instilled, and the villagers left with a clear message: submit or face annihilation. The Vikings were brutal, but methodical. Their reputation for fear was earned, not given, built on generations of strategy, skill, and intelligence. While the raiders struck the village, other ships circled, watching the coastline for reinforcements. Coordination was key. Timing and precision made the difference between victory and disaster. The Vikings struck swiftly, overwhelming their enemies, then vanished as quickly as they appeared. No one could predict their next move. They were shadows on the water, unstoppable and elusive, a force that reshaped the world wherever they traveled. Back in Scandinavia, villages along rivers and lakes were hubs of preparation and learning. Children trained in rowing and navigation before they could walk. Warriors practiced with weapons, forged by the finest smiths. Women oversaw trade, managed estates, and commanded ships when necessary. Every member of society contributed to the growing power of the Viking world. Preparation and discipline were essential. The success of every expedition depended on the skills and coordination developed at home, ensuring that each journey into the unknown had the highest chance of success. Trade was as important as raiding. Objects from distant lands, bronze from the Mediterranean, silk from the East, glass from France, moved through Viking hands, centuries ahead of widespread European trade. Each item was more than wealth. It was influence, proof that these raiders were also diplomats and strategists. Every expedition, whether raid or trade mission, expanded their reach, strengthened their networks, and solidified their place in the growing European stage. By the 9th century, the Vikings had refined their society into a highly organized system of mobility, intelligence, and adaptability. Long ships were faster and sturdier, capable of crossing rivers, seas, and oceans. Intelligence and planning became as vital as strength. Geography and natural forces were tools to be mastered. Every river bend, every coastal inlet, every tide and wind pattern was known, studied, and exploited. Knowledge was their greatest weapon. Women held positions of immense power. Archaeological evidence shows them commanding ships, managing estates, and shaping strategy. One remarkable burial in Norway contained an elderly woman, accompanied by a ship, treasures, and a slave, whose origins stretched thousands of miles east. These women influenced trade, expeditions, and political decisions. Power was not defined by gender, it was defined by skill, strategy, and leadership. Their contributions were central to the success and expansion of Viking civilization. Every voyage, raid, and trade mission reinforced the structure of Viking society. Success depended on preparation, adaptability, and intelligence. Tributary towns, alliances, and settlements expanded influence far beyond the immediate battlefield. Unpredictability was the Vikings' greatest weapon. Enemies could never anticipate when or where they would strike. Nature, geography, and human behavior all became instruments of power, wielded with precision. Even as they expanded, the Vikings were constantly tested by the elements. Storms destroyed ships, rivers froze, tides shifted unexpectedly. Yet, these obstacles became lessons. Every disaster strengthened future strategies. Every miscalculation improved preparation. Adaptation became survival. Survival became power. Power became legend. The Vikings thrived because they mastered uncertainty, turning potential disasters into opportunities. By the early 10th century, their impact was undeniable. Raids, trade, and settlements had left indelible marks across England, Francia, Ireland, and beyond. But the Vikings were more than conquerors. They were explorers, diplomats, rulers, and strategists. Every journey expanded their influence. Every settlement reinforced their control. Their reach extended beyond fear, shaping economies, politics, and culture. The rivers, ports, and coastlines of Scandinavia became engines of empire. Farms supplied food, blacksmiths weapons, and shipbuilders long ships capable of long-range travel and combat. Every member of society contributed to the success of expeditions. Knowledge, skill, and preparation ensured that they could strike faster, travel further, and influence more. Every village, every port, every river became a strategic node in a growing network that spanned the continent. Longships carried warriors, traders, and envoys, spreading influence, ideas, and culture. Every conquest, trade mission, and settlement left an imprint on the regions they touched. The Vikings were not just raiders. They were empire builders, strategists, and innovators. Each expedition reinforced their power, spread knowledge, and expanded the civilization. Even as they extended their reach, lessons from past journeys were never forgotten. Every raid, trade negotiation, and conflict taught navigation, combat and diplomacy, missteps became blueprints for improvement. Adaptation and learning were as critical as courage and strength. The unpredictable nature of seas and enemies made them sharper, faster, and more efficient with each voyage. The Vikings' story had become continental. Raids, settlements, and trade networks connected lands that had never interacted before. They influenced economies, politics, and culture, leaving legacies that would endure for centuries. Every ship, every expedition, every leader contributed to a civilization defined by intelligence, strategy, and mastery of the sea. And as the long ships disappeared into mist and distance, warriors and traders alike carried ambition, skill, and legacy. The world was unprepared for the full force of these northern voyages. The Vikings were coming not just as raiders, but as architects of history, shaping kingdoms, economies, and cultures forever. The horizon was alive with movement as dozens of longships cut through the waves, their sails taut in the wind. Every warrior was alert, eyes scanning the distant coastline for signs of life or danger. The sea had taught them patience, precision, and fearlessness. One miscalculation could mean disaster. But the Vikings had mastered uncertainty. Their lives depended on it. Every expedition was a test. Every journey a chance to prove their dominance. Ahead, smoke rose from a settlement nestled among the cliffs. Fishermen hauled nets, merchants carried baskets, and children ran along narrow paths, unaware of the approaching shadow. The Vikings had learned to move silently, striking before their prey even realized the danger. Observation, timing, and strategy were as crucial as the weapons they carried. Every detail mattered. The tilt of a roof, the direction of smoke, the rhythm of daily life. These were the signals that guided the raiders to success. The first boats reached the shore. Warriors leapt into the shallow water, axes swinging, shields interlocked. Chaos erupted instantly, but it was controlled, precise, deliberate. Leaders were seized, wealth collected, and defenses neutralized. Fear spread like wildfire, leaving a message etched into memory. The Vikings were unstoppable. Their reputation was built not just on violence, but on intelligence, planning, and relentless execution. Every strike reinforced the myth of their invincibility. Scouts on other ships circled the bay, watching for reinforcements. Coordination was lethal. Timing could turn a simple raid into a decisive victory. The Vikings had learned to synchronize their actions perfectly. One misstep, one delay, and the tide could turn. But their experience gave them an edge. Their moves were calculated, almost mechanical, yet fueled by instinct honed over generations. Every expedition was an exercise in precision. Back home, villages along rivers and lakes were alive with preparation. Children practiced rowing and combat techniques before they could walk. Women managed estates, controlled trade, and sometimes commanded longships. Men trained with weapons, perfected strategies, and ensured every expedition had the resources it needed. Society was a finely tuned machine, each component essential to the success of their ambitious voyages. Preparation was survival, and survival was power. Trade complemented raids: bronze from the Mediterranean, glass from France, silk from the East. These items flowed through Viking hands, centuries ahead of widespread European commerce. Objects of wealth became instruments of influence. Each acquisition, whether taken by force or earned through negotiation, strengthened their networks. Archaeology reveals the sophistication of these northern raiders. They were strategists, merchants, diplomats, and warriors, often simultaneously. Every object tells a story of ambition, cunning, and far-reaching influence. By the 9th century, the Vikings had perfected mobility, intelligence, and adaptability. Longships were swift, durable, and capable of navigating rivers, seas, and oceans. Geography and weather were weapons, and knowledge of tides, currents, and winds gave them advantages no other civilization could match. Intelligence and planning were as deadly as axes and spears. Every bend in a river, every hidden cove, every tidal pattern was memorized and exploited. Knowledge became power, and the Vikings wielded it ruthlessly. Women played critical roles in maintaining Viking dominance. Archaeological evidence shows women buried with weapons, treasures, and ships. One grave in Norway revealed an elderly woman accompanied by a ship, valuable goods, and a slave from Far Eastern lands. These women shaped strategy, trade, and governance, proving leadership was determined by ability, not gender. They were essential to the success and expansion of Viking influence. Every expedition, whether for trade or raiding, reinforced Viking society. Tributary towns, alliances, and settlements extended their influence far beyond the battlefield. Their unpredictability became a tactical advantage. Enemies could never anticipate their next move. The Vikings exploited every aspect of nature, geography, and human psychology to secure victory. Adaptation and intelligence were as vital as courage and strength. Nature continued to test them. Storms could destroy ships, rivers freeze, and tides shift unexpectedly. Each challenge was an opportunity to improve, to innovate, to survive. Adaptation became the cornerstone of power. Survival created legends. The Vikings thrived because they understood unpredictability and mastered it, turning danger into opportunity. By the early 10th century, their presence was felt across northern Europe. England, Francia, Ireland, and beyond bore the mark of Viking influence. Yet, they were not only raiders, they were explorers, rulers, and strategists. Every voyage expanded knowledge, every settlement strengthened control. Their influence extended beyond fear, reaching into trade, culture, and politics. The rivers and coastlines of Scandinavia were engines of empire. Farms fed expeditions, blacksmiths supplied weapons, and shipbuilders created vessels capable of long-range travel and warfare. Every village was part of a network that allowed the Vikings to strike farther, faster, and with precision. Knowledge, skill, and preparation ensured that each journey was successful. Longships carried not only warriors but culture, diplomacy, and influence. Every conquest and trade mission spread Viking ideas and customs, leaving lasting imprints on Europe. They were empire builders, strategists, and innovators. Every expedition reinforced their power and extended their civilization. Lessons from previous journeys were never forgotten. Every raid, negotiation, and conflict informed future strategy. Missteps became blueprints for success. Adaptation and learning were as crucial as bravery and strength. The unpredictability of sea and enemy shaped a people faster, smarter, and more effective with each voyage. The Viking story had become continental. Raids, settlements, and trade networks connected lands previously isolated. Economies were transformed, politics influenced, and culture reshaped. Each ship, each expedition, and each leader contributed to a civilization defined by intelligence, strategy, and mastery of the seas. The longships disappeared into mist, carrying ambition, knowledge, and legacy. The world was unaware of the force approaching. The Vikings were coming, not just as raiders, but as shapers of history, building kingdoms, influencing economies, and leaving marks that would endure forever. The morning fog hung thick over the fjords, wrapping the coastline in a grey, impenetrable cloak. From the decks of the longships, the Vikings peered into the mist, every eye sharp, every muscle tense. The sea was calm but deceptive. Beneath the stillness lurked hidden dangers, rocks, currents, and the unpredictable moods of nature. The Vikings had learned to read every ripple, every gust of wind, every subtle change. Survival demanded vigilance. Ahead, a cluster of smoke plumes rose from the shore. Villagers were going about their morning routines, oblivious to the shadows sliding silently across the water. Dogs barked, merchants unloaded crates, and children laughed near the riverbank. The Vikings moved with practiced stealth. Their attacks were not mere chaos. They were calculated precision. Every observation mattered. The angle of smoke, the glint of metal in sunlight, the placement of animals. These signs determined strategy, ensured success, and minimized risk. The first longships reached the beach. Warriors leapt into the shallow water, boots sinking into mud and sand. Axes swung, shields clanged, and controlled chaos erupted. Leaders and merchants were seized, wealth collected, and defenses neutralized. Fear spread instantly, leaving an unmistakable message: the Vikings were unstoppable. Their legend was carefully earned over generations, built on skill, intelligence, and timing, as much as on brute strength. Meanwhile, scouts circled the bay on other ships, eyes scanning for reinforcements. Coordination and timing were deadly weapons. One delay could turn victory into disaster, but the Vikings had mastered this rhythm. Every movement was precise, almost mechanical, yet guided by instinct honed over centuries. Every expedition became a test of strategy, discipline, and nerve, and each success reinforced their dominance across coasts and rivers alike. Back in Scandinavia, the villages along the rivers were alive with preparation. Children learned rowing, navigation, and combat before they could walk. Men trained with weapons, honing their skills for the challenges of both battle and exploration. Women managed estates, controlled trade, and sometimes commanded expeditions themselves. Every member of society contributed to the growing strength of the Viking world. Preparation was survival, and survival was power. Trade remained as crucial as raiding. Bronze from the Mediterranean, glass from France, silk from the East, all flowed through Viking hands. Objects became instruments of influence and status. Archaeology reveals that these so-called barbarians were sophisticated players in a complex global network. They negotiated, exchanged, and leveraged trade to reinforce their dominance. Every artifact tells a story of ambition, strategy, and far-reaching reach. By the 9th century, the Vikings had perfected mobility, intelligence, and adaptability. Longships were swift, durable, and capable of navigating rivers, seas, and oceans. Knowledge of tides, winds, and geography was as lethal as any weapon. Every cove, river bend, and inlet was memorized and exploited. Their mastery of knowledge and strategy gave them advantages that no enemy could predict or counter. Women's roles in Viking society were extraordinary. Archaeological finds show women buried with weapons, wealth, and ships. One remarkable grave in Norway held an elderly woman, her ship, treasures, and a slave from the distant east. These women were strategists, leaders, and influencers. Power was not determined by gender, it was determined by skill, intelligence, and influence. Their contributions shaped Viking society and ensured the success of expeditions, trade, and governance. Every voyage, raid, and trade mission reinforced the Viking social structure. Success depended on preparation, adaptability, and intelligence. Tributary towns, settlements, and alliances extended influence far beyond individual battles. The Vikings' unpredictability was a tactical advantage. Enemies could never foresee the next strike. Nature, geography, and human behavior were exploited with precision, transforming threats into weapons of power. Even as they expanded, the Vikings were constantly tested by the elements. Storms destroyed ships, rivers froze, and tides shifted unexpectedly. Every challenge became a lesson, every failure a blueprint for improvement. Adaptability ensured survival. Survival built power. Power created legends. The Vikings thrived because they had learned to harness uncertainty, turning danger into opportunity. By the early 10th century, Viking influence was undeniable. Their raids, settlements and trade networks had transformed England, Francia, Ireland and beyond. Yet, they were not merely conquerors. They were explorers, rulers and strategists. Every voyage expanded their reach. Every settlement reinforced authority, and their influence penetrated commerce, diplomacy and culture. The rivers and coastlines of Scandinavia were engines of empire. Farms fed expeditions, blacksmiths produced weapons, and shipbuilders perfected longships capable of long-range travel and combat. Each village was a node in a strategic network. Knowledge, skill, and preparation ensured that each journey could reach farther, strike faster, and influence more. Longships carried warriors, traders, and envoys, spreading influence, ideas, and culture. Conquests and trade missions left lasting marks, transforming societies. The Vikings were not only raiders, they were architects of an emerging civilization, combining strategy, commerce, and military power. Each expedition reinforced their growing empire. Lessons from past journeys were never forgotten. Every raid, negotiation, and battle informed the next strategy. Missteps became plans for future success. Adaptation and learning were as vital as courage and skill. The unpredictability of the sea and of their enemies made them faster, smarter, and more efficient with each voyage. The Viking story had become continental. Raids, settlements, and trade networks connected lands previously isolated. Economies, politics, and culture were reshaped. Each ship, each expedition, and each leader contributed to a civilization defined by intelligence, strategy, and mastery of the seas. As the longships slipped into the mist, carrying men and women who would leave a lasting legacy, the world remained unaware of the power approaching. The Vikings were coming, not only as raiders, but as forces that would shape kingdoms, economies, and histories for generations to come. The wind had shifted, bringing a biting chill that cut through the layers of wool and leather. The Vikings tightened their grips on oars and ropes. Every man and woman aboard knew the sea could turn on them in a heartbeat. One wrong wave, one misjudged current, and disaster awaited. Yet they did not flinch. The North had forged them. Ice, wind, and water had sharpened their instincts, teaching patience, timing, and the cruel precision of survival. Ahead, smoke curled lazily from a distant settlement, rising above the trees like a signal to the untrained eye. The villagers were oblivious to the silent predators approaching over the water. Dogs barked, merchants unloaded goods, children ran along narrow paths. The Vikings had mastered the art of reading these signs, the direction of smoke, the movement of livestock, the faint sound of human activity. Every detail informed strategy. Every observation increased their advantage. The first boats reached the shore. Warriors leapt into the shallow water, axes swinging, shields raised. Chaos erupted immediately, but it was orchestrated, controlled, precise. Leaders were captured first, merchants second, and defenses neutralized swiftly. Wealth was seized, fear instilled. The Vikings were as calculated as they were brutal. Their reputation was no accident. Every raid reinforced the myth of their invincibility, combining intelligence, discipline, and sheer force. Scouts circled the bay on other ships, vigilant for reinforcements or threats. Coordination and timing were deadly weapons. Delay could mean disaster. But the Vikings' rhythm was flawless. Every movement was deliberate, almost mechanical, yet guided by instincts sharpened over generations. Each expedition became a test of strategy, timing, and nerve, and every success expanded their dominance across coasts and rivers. In Scandinavia, villages thrived as centers of preparation and innovation. Children learned rowing, navigation, and combat skills before they could walk. Men trained with weapons, refined tactics, and ensured that resources were ready for every expedition. Women managed estates, oversaw trade, and commanded ships when needed. Society operated like a well-oiled machine, every member essential to success. Preparation equaled survival, and survival equaled power. Trade was as important as raiding. Bronze from the Mediterranean, glass from France, silk from the East, all flowed through Viking hands, centuries ahead of most European networks. These objects were more than wealth, they were tools of influence. Archaeological evidence confirms that Vikings were not isolated barbarians, but sophisticated strategists, merchants, and diplomats. Every object tells a story of ambition, calculation, and reach, a testament to their ability to navigate the complexities of a connected world. By the 9th century, the Vikings had mastered mobility, intelligence, and adaptability. Longships were swift, durable, and capable of traversing rivers, seas, and oceans. Knowledge of tides, winds, and geography was as lethal as any sword or axe. Every cove, river bend, and inlet was memorized and exploited. Mastery of knowledge turned the sea into a weapon. They wielded intelligence as powerfully as any blade. Women were central to Viking society. Archaeology reveals burials with women buried alongside weapons, treasures, and even ships. One remarkable grave in Norway held an elderly woman, her ship, and a slave from the Far East. These women influenced strategy, trade, and politics, demonstrating that power was determined by skill and intelligence, rather than gender. They were instrumental in shaping Viking expeditions and maintaining dominance. Every raid, expedition, and trade mission reinforced social structure. Tributary towns, settlements, and alliances extended influence far beyond the battlefield. Unpredictability became a tactical advantage. Enemies never knew when or where the Vikings would strike next. Nature, geography, and human behavior were tools to be exploited. Adaptation and intelligence were as crucial as courage and strength. The elements remained relentless. Storms could destroy ships, rivers could freeze, and tides shift without warning. Yet every challenge became a lesson. Every mistake a blueprint for improvement. Adaptability ensured survival. Survival created power. Power forged legend. The Vikings thrived because they turned uncertainty into opportunity, mastering danger as they mastered the seas. By the early 10th century, the Vikings had reshaped northern Europe. Their raids, settlements, and trade networks left indelible marks across England, Francia, and Ireland. Yet they were more than raiders, they were explorers, rulers, and strategists. Every expedition expanded knowledge, every settlement reinforced control, every trade mission strengthened influence. They penetrated commerce, diplomacy, and culture with equal precision. Scandinavia's rivers and coastlines were engines of empire. Farms fed expeditions, blacksmiths forged weapons, and shipbuilders created longships capable of long-range travel and warfare. Every village, every port, every river served as a strategic node. Knowledge, skill, and preparation allowed the Vikings to strike farther, faster, and with greater precision. Longships carried warriors, traders, and diplomats, spreading influence, ideas, and culture. Each conquest and trade mission left lasting marks, reshaping societies, Vikings were architects of civilization as much as conquerors. Every expedition reinforced their power and extended their influence, creating a network that spanned Europe. Lessons from past voyages were never forgotten. Every raid, negotiation, and battle informed the next. Missteps became blueprints for success. Adaptation and learning were as essential as courage and skill. The unpredictable sea and unpredictable enemies honed them into faster, smarter, and more effective voyages. Their story had become continental. Raids, settlements, and trade networks connected lands previously isolated. Economies transformed, politics shifted, and culture evolved. Each ship, expedition, and leader contributed to a civilization defined by intelligence, strategy, and mastery of the seas. The longships disappeared into the mist, carrying ambition, knowledge, and legacy. The world remained unaware of the force approaching. The Vikings were coming not merely as raiders, but as shapers of kingdoms, economies, and history itself. The sun broke through the morning fog, casting sharp beams across the fjords. The water glittered, hiding treacherous rocks and currents beneath its surface. The Vikings rowed silently, muscles coiled, hearts pounding. They had faced the sea in every condition imaginable, storms, ice, and hidden shoals, but each voyage brought new lessons. The ocean was a teacher, cruel yet wise. Every ripple, every gust of wind, every wave could decide life or death. Ahead, the thin smoke of a village curled against the cliffs. Farmers tended their fields, merchants carried baskets, children laughed near the river. They were unaware of the approaching shadow. The Vikings had perfected the art of observation. They read signs invisible to ordinary eyes, the tilt of a roof, the movement of animals, the faint scent of smoke on the wind. Every detail informed their plan, increasing the chances of success and reducing risk. The first longships reached the shoreline. Warriors leapt into the shallow water, shields clashing, axes swinging. Chaos erupted instantly, yet it was controlled. Leaders were seized, wealth collected, defenses dismantled. The Vikings were ruthless, but precise. Their fearsome reputation was carefully earned over generations. Every raid reinforced their dominance, built not only through strength, but through strategy, timing, and intelligence. Scouts circled the bay, vigilant for reinforcements. Coordination and timing were lethal. One mistake could spell disaster. But the Vikings' movements were flawless. Every action was deliberate, guided by instincts sharpened over centuries. Every expedition became a test of strategy and nerve. Success reinforced their dominance across rivers, coasts, and seas. Back home, Scandinavian villages were hubs of preparation. Children trained in rowing, navigation, and combat before they could walk. Men practiced with weapons, refining tactics and ensuring expeditions were fully supplied. Women managed estates, oversaw trade, and sometimes commanded ships. Every member of society contributed to the growing strength of the Viking world. Preparation meant survival, and survival meant power. Trade was as essential as raiding. Bronze from the Mediterranean, glass from France, silk from the East, all moved through Viking hands, centuries ahead of much of Europe. Wealth was influence. Objects became instruments of power. Archaeology proves that the Vikings were not isolated barbarians, but sophisticated strategists, merchants, and diplomats. Every artifact tells a story of ambition, calculation, and connection to a wider world. By the 9th century, mobility, intelligence, and adaptability defined Viking society. Longships were swift, durable, and capable of crossing rivers, seas, and oceans. Knowledge of tides, winds, and geography was a weapon as deadly as any sword. Every inlet, river bend and cove was memorized and exploited. Mastery of knowledge turned the environment into a force multiplier. Intelligence became a weapon as sharp as an axe. Women played critical roles. Archaeological evidence shows women buried with weapons, wealth and ships. One grave in Norway contained an elderly woman, her ship, treasures and a slave from the distant east. Women influenced strategy, trade and politics. Leadership was determined by skill, intelligence and influence. These women shaped expeditions and strengthened Viking society. Every raid, voyage and trade mission reinforced Viking structure. Tributary towns, settlements and alliances extended their reach far beyond battlefields. Unpredictability became a tactical advantage. Enemies could never foresee the Vikings' next strike. Nature, geography and human behavior were tools to exploit. Adaptation and intelligence were as essential as courage and strength. Nature remained an ever-present challenge. Storms destroyed ships, rivers froze, tides shifted unexpectedly. Every challenge became a lesson. Every failure a blueprint for improvement. Adaptability ensured survival. Survival created power. Power forged legend. The Vikings thrived by turning uncertainty into opportunity, mastering the seas and their own limits. By the 10th century, Viking influence was undeniable. Raids, settlements, and trade networks transformed England, Francia, Ireland, and beyond. They were more than raiders. They were explorers, rulers, and strategists. Every voyage expanded knowledge. Every settlement reinforced control. Every trade mission strengthened influence. Their reach extended beyond fear, reshaping commerce, diplomacy, and culture. Rivers and coastlines became engines of empire. Farms fed expeditions. Blacksmiths produced weapons, and shipbuilders perfected longships. Every village was a node in a strategic network. Knowledge, skill, and preparation ensured that each expedition could strike farther, faster, and with precision. Longships carried warriors, traders, and diplomats. Each conquest and trade mission spread ideas, culture, and influence. The Vikings were architects of civilization as much as conquerors. Every journey reinforced power and extended their reach, building a network that spanned Europe. Lessons from past voyages shaped future strategies. Every raid, negotiation, and battle informed the next plan. Mistakes became blueprints for improvement. Adaptation and learning were essential. The unpredictability of the sea and of enemies honed them into sharper, faster, and more effective voyages. The story of the Vikings became continental. Raids, settlements, and trade networks connected lands previously isolated. Economies shifted, politics evolved, and culture transformed. Every ship, expedition, and leader contributed to a civilization defined by intelligence, strategy, and mastery of the seas. As longships disappeared into mist carrying warriors, traders, and visionaries, the world remained unaware of the force approaching. The Vikings were coming, not just as raiders, but as builders of kingdoms, shapers of economies, and creators of history itself. The fjords were silent except for the splash of oars and the creak of timber under tension. The Vikings moved with purpose, every movement precise, every glance scanning for danger. The sea was their teacher. Its moods were unpredictable, its patterns complex. One misstep could crush a longship against hidden rocks or sweep a warrior into icy depths. They had learned to respect it, to read it, to harness it. Smoke rose faintly from a settlement ahead. Villagers were oblivious, farmers tending fields, merchants unloading goods, children playing near the riverbank. The Vikings had perfected observation. They could read subtle signs, invisible to ordinary eyes. the curl of smoke, the shift of livestock, the faint sound of tools on wood. Every detail informed strategy, minimized risk, and maximized advantage. The first longships reached the shore. Warriors leapt into the shallow water, shields clashing, axes swinging. Chaos erupted instantly, but it was controlled. Leaders were seized, wealth collected, defenses neutralized. Fear spread like wildfire, and the Vikings' reputation grew. Every raid reinforced the legend. Strength alone was not enough. They relied on intelligence, timing, and coordination. Their power was precise, not random. Scouts circled the bay, eyes sharp for reinforcements. Coordination and timing were as lethal as weapons. One misstep could turn triumph into disaster, but the Vikings' precision was unmatched. Every action was deliberate, guided by instincts sharpened over generations. Each expedition tested strategy, nerve, and adaptability. Success reinforced dominance across rivers, coasts, and seas. In Scandinavia, villages thrived as centers of preparation. Children learned rowing, navigation, and combat before they could walk. Men trained relentlessly, ensuring every expedition was supplied, every weapon sharpened. Women oversaw estates, managed trade, and commanded ships when necessary. Every member of society contributed to Viking strength. Preparation equaled survival. Survival equaled power. Trade was just as critical as raiding. Bronze from the Mediterranean, glass from France, silk from the East, all flowed through Viking hands, centuries ahead of much of Europe. Objects of wealth became instruments of influence. Archaeological evidence confirms that the Vikings were sophisticated strategists, merchants, and diplomats. Each artifact tells a story of ambition, calculation, and a network spanning continents. By the 9th century, Vikings had perfected mobility, intelligence, and adaptability. Longships were fast, durable, capable of navigating rivers, seas, and oceans. Knowledge of tides, winds, and geography became a weapon as deadly as an axe. Every cove, river bend, and inlet was memorized and exploited. Mastery of knowledge transformed the environment into a strategic advantage. Intelligence was as powerful as strength. Women held extraordinary roles. Archaeology shows them buried with weapons, treasures, and ships. One grave in Norway contained an elderly woman, her ship, riches, and a slave from the distant east. Women influenced strategy, trade, and politics. Leadership was determined by skill and intelligence, not gender. They shaped expeditions and reinforced Viking society. Every raid, voyage, and trade mission reinforced Viking social structure. Tributary towns, settlements, and alliances extended influence far beyond battlefields. Unpredictability was a weapon. Enemies could never anticipate strikes. Nature, geography, and human behavior were tools. Adaptation and intelligence were as vital as courage and strength. The elements tested them constantly. Storms could destroy ships. Rivers could freeze. Tides could shift without warning. Every challenge was a lesson. Every failure became a blueprint for improvement. Adaptability ensured survival. Survival created power. Power forged legend. The Vikings thrived because they turned danger into opportunity. By the early 10th century, their influence was evident. Raids, settlements, and trade networks reshaped England, Francia, Ireland, and beyond. They were not just raiders, they were explorers, rulers, and strategists. Every expedition expanded knowledge, every settlement reinforced control, every trade mission strengthened influence. They reshaped commerce, diplomacy, and culture. Rivers and coastlines became engines of empire. Farms fed expeditions, blacksmiths produced weapons, shipbuilders perfected longships capable of long-range travel and warfare. Every village was a strategic node. Knowledge, skill, and preparation allowed strikes to be faster, farther, and more precise. Longships carried warriors, traders, and diplomats, spreading influence, ideas, and culture. Each conquest and trade mission left lasting marks. Vikings were architects of civilization as much as conquerors. Every expedition reinforced power and extended reach, creating a network spanning Europe. Lessons from past voyages informed the future. Every raid, negotiation, and battle shaped the next plan. Mistakes became lessons. Adaptation and learning were essential. The unpredictable sea and enemies honed them into sharper, faster, and more efficient voyages. Their story became continental. Raids, settlements, and trade networks connected lands once isolated. Economies shifted, politics evolved, culture transformed. Every ship, expedition, and leader contributed to a civilization defined by intelligence, strategy, and mastery of the seas. As longships disappeared into the mist, carrying ambition, skill, and legacy, the world remained unaware. The Vikings were coming not only as raiders, but as shapers of kingdoms, economies, and history itself. The horizon was a smear of grey and gold as the sun rose over jagged cliffs. The long ships cut through the morning mist, silent but deadly. Every warrior was alert, eyes scanning for signs of life or threat. The sea had tested them countless times, and each test had sharpened their instincts. Ice, wind, waves. These were their teachers. Every journey, every storm, every hidden shoal had prepared them for the challenges ahead. Smoke rose faintly from a village tucked between the cliffs. Farmers tilled the soil, merchants moved goods, children played. They were unaware of the shadow approaching over the water. The Vikings observed with precision. They read subtle signs invisible to ordinary eyes: the tilt of a roof, the angle of smoke, the movement of animals. Every detail informed strategy, minimized risk, and maximized advantage. The first longships reached the shore. Warriors plunged into the shallow water, shields clashing, axes swinging. Chaos erupted, but it was controlled. Leaders were captured, wealth seized, defenses neutralized. Fear spread instantly. The Vikings' reputation was no accident. Every raid was carefully calculated. Strategy, timing, and intelligence were as important as strength. The Vikings' power was precise, relentless, and unstoppable. Scouts circled the bay, vigilant for reinforcements. Coordination and timing were deadly. One mistake could turn victory into defeat, but the Vikings' rhythm was flawless. Every action deliberate, guided by instincts honed over generations. Each expedition tested strategy, nerve, and adaptability. Success reinforced dominance across rivers, coasts, and seas. Back home, villages along the rivers and fjords thrived as centers of preparation. Children practiced rowing, navigation, and combat before they could walk. Men trained relentlessly, weapons honed, supplies organized. Women managed estates, oversaw trade, and commanded ships. Every member of society contributed to the growing strength of the Viking world. Preparation equaled survival. Survival equaled power. Trade was as vital as raiding. Bronze from the Mediterranean, glass from France, silk from the East, all flowed through Viking hands. Objects of wealth became instruments of influence. Archaeology proves the Vikings were not isolated barbarians, but sophisticated strategists, merchants, and diplomats. Each artifact tells a story of ambition, calculation, and a network spanning continents. By the 9th century, mobility, intelligence, and adaptability defined the Vikings. Longships were swift, durable, and capable of navigating rivers, seas, and oceans. Knowledge of tides, winds, and geography became weapons as deadly as any axe or sword. Every inlet, river bend, and cove was memorized and exploited. Intelligence was as lethal as strength. Mastery of the environment became a decisive advantage. Women were central to Viking society. Archaeology shows women buried with weapons, treasures, and ships. One grave in Norway contained an elderly woman, her ship, valuables, and a slave from the distant east. Women influenced strategy, trade, and politics. Leadership depended on skill and intelligence, not gender. They shaped expeditions and strengthened Viking society. Every raid, voyage, and trade mission reinforced Viking social structure. Tributary towns, settlements, and alliances extended influence far beyond battlefields. Unpredictability became a weapon. Enemies could never anticipate the Vikings' next move. Nature, geography, and human behavior were tools to exploit. Adaptation and intelligence were as vital as courage and strength. The elements tested them constantly. Storms could destroy ships, rivers freeze, tides shift without warning. Each challenge became a lesson. Every failure, a blueprint for improvement. Adaptability ensured survival. Survival created power. Power forged legend. The Vikings thrived because they turned danger into opportunity, mastering the seas and their own limits. By the early 10th century, their presence was undeniable. Raids, settlements, and trade networks transformed England, Francia, Ireland, and beyond. They were explorers, rulers, and strategists. Every voyage expanded knowledge. Every settlement reinforced control. Every trade mission strengthened influence. Their reach extended beyond fear, reshaping commerce, diplomacy, and culture. Scandinavia's rivers and coastlines were engines of empire. Farms fed expeditions. Blacksmiths produced weapons. Shipbuilders perfected longships, capable of long-range travel and warfare. Every village was a strategic node. Knowledge, skill, and preparation allowed them to strike farther, faster, and with precision. Longships carried warriors, traders, and diplomats, spreading influence, ideas, and culture. Conquests and trade missions left lasting marks. The Vikings were architects of civilization as much as conquerors. Every expedition reinforced power and extended reach, creating a network spanning Europe. Lessons from past voyages shaped future strategies. Every raid, negotiation, and battle informed the next plan. Mistakes became lessons. Adaptation and learning were essential. The unpredictable sea and enemies honed them into sharper, faster, and more efficient voyages. Their story became continental. Raids, settlements, and trade networks connected lands once isolated. Economies shifted. Politics evolved. Culture transformed. Every ship, expedition, and leader contributed to a civilization defined by intelligence, strategy, and mastery of the seas. The longships disappeared into mist, carrying ambition, skill, and legacy. The world remained unaware. The Vikings were coming, not merely as raiders, but as builders of kingdoms, shapers of economies, and creators of history itself. The final voyage began under a sky streaked with clouds, grey and foreboding. Waves crashed against the longships, rocking them violently. Each oar sliced through water with purpose, each warrior tense, every mind alert. The Vikings had faced countless storms, hidden shoals, and the unpredictable temper of the sea, yet nothing could break their resolve. They had been forged by the north, shaped by ice, wind, and waves. Ahead, The faint smoke of distant settlements curled into the morning air. Villagers were oblivious, absorbed in daily routines. Children ran barefoot. Merchants carried baskets. Dogs barked at passing birds. The Vikings watched silently, reading every subtle sign: the slope of roofs, the direction of smoke, the sound of footsteps. Observation was their weapon, patience their strength. Every detail informed the strategy, ensured success, and minimized risk. The first boats hit the shore. Warriors leapt into the shallow water, shields raised, axes swinging. Chaos erupted, but it was orchestrated, deliberate. Leaders were captured first. Wealth seized, defenses dismantled swiftly. Fear spread instantly. The Vikings' reputation was no accident. Every strike was precise. Strength alone was not enough. Timing, intelligence, and coordination turned raids into legends. Scouts circled the bay, eyes sharp for reinforcements. Coordination and timing were as deadly as weapons. One mistake could turn victory into disaster, but the Vikings' rhythm was flawless. Every action was deliberate, instinctive, and guided by generations of experience. Each expedition tested strategy, nerve, and adaptability. Success reinforced their dominance across rivers, coasts, and seas. Back home, the villages along fjords and rivers buzzed with preparation. Children learned rowing, navigation, and combat before they could walk. Men trained relentlessly, weapons sharpened, supplies organized. Women managed estates, oversaw trade, and commanded ships when necessary. Every member of society contributed to Viking power. Preparation equaled survival, and survival equaled influence. Trade was as critical as raiding. Bronze from the Mediterranean, glass from France, silk from the East, all flowed through Viking hands, centuries ahead of much of Europe. Wealth became influence. Objects were tools of power. Archaeology proves that Vikings were not isolated barbarians, but sophisticated strategists, merchants, and diplomats. Every artifact tells a story of ambition, foresight, and reach. By the 9th century, mobility, intelligence, and adaptability defined the Vikings. Longships were swift, durable, and capable of navigating rivers, seas, and oceans. Knowledge of tides, winds, and geography became as lethal as swords or axes. Every cove, river bend, and inlet was memorized and exploited. Intelligence became a weapon, the environment a strategic advantage. Women were central to Viking society. Archaeology shows them buried with weapons, treasures, and even ships. One grave in Norway contained an elderly woman, her ship, valuables, and a slave from the distant east. Women influenced strategy, trade, and politics. Leadership depended on skill, intelligence, and influence. These women strengthened expeditions and fortified Viking society. Every raid, voyage, and trade mission reinforced social structure. Tributary towns, settlements, and alliances extended influence far beyond battlefields. Unpredictability was a tactical advantage. Enemies could never anticipate Viking movements. Nature, geography, and human behavior were tools to exploit. Adaptation and intelligence were as vital as courage and strength. The elements were constant tests. Storms could destroy ships, rivers freeze, tides shift. Every challenge became a lesson, every failure a blueprint for improvement. Adaptation ensured survival. Survival created power. Power forged legend. The Vikings thrived by turning danger into opportunity. By the early 10th century, Viking influence reshaped Europe. Raids, settlements, and trade networks touched England, Francia, Ireland, and beyond. They were not just raiders, they were explorers, rulers, and strategists. Every voyage expounded knowledge, every settlement reinforced control, every trade mission strengthened influence. Commerce, diplomacy, and culture were forever altered. Scandinavia's rivers and coastlines became engines of empire, farms fed expeditions, blacksmiths produced weapons, and shipbuilders perfected long ships capable of long-range travel and warfare. Every village was a strategic node. Knowledge, skill, and preparation ensured that each journey struck farther, faster, and with precision. Longships carried warriors, traders, and diplomats, spreading ideas, influence, and culture. Every conquest, every trade mission left enduring marks. The Vikings were architects of civilization as much as conquerors. Every expedition reinforced power, extending their network across Europe. Lessons from past voyages shaped the future. Every raid, negotiation, and battle informed the next plan. Mistakes became lessons. Adaptation and learning were essential. The unpredictable sea and enemies honed them into sharper, faster, and more effective voyages. The Viking story became continental. Raids, settlements, and trade networks connected lands once isolated. Economies transformed, politics evolved, and culture shifted. Every ship, expedition, and leader contributed to a civilization defined by intelligence, strategy, and mastery of the seas. The long ships disappeared into the horizon, carrying ambition, skill, and legacy. The world remained unaware of the force approaching. The Vikings were coming, not merely as raiders, but as builders of kingdoms, shapers of economies, and creators of history itself. Their legend, their mastery of sea and strategy, would echo across centuries. The North had forged them, the sea had tested them, and history had remembered them. They were the Vikings. The Viking saga spans centuries of exploration, trade, warfare, and culture. From the icy fjords of Scandinavia to distant settlements across Europe, they were masters of the sea, architects of civilizations, and shapers of history. Every longship, every expedition, every artifact tells the story of intelligence, strategy, and relentless determination. They were more than raiders, they were traders, leaders, and legends whose influence would echo through the ages.